Welcome to our program, General Newton.
Great to be here. Thank you. Good to be with you, Daniel.
I would like to begin our discussions with the war in Ukraine and the state of the war right now. From your perspective, where this war is headed right now, how can you assess the current situation in Ukraine?
Well, the current situation is where, first off, let's start with Russia. I believe Russia is in probably a more precarious position than we've seen over the last 12 months. Certainly, if you compared Russia to where they were 12 months or so ago, frankly, with Ukraine still maintaining a tough tenacity effort in terms of not only in Russian Oblast area, in the Kursk Oblast area rather, but also defending its own territory, whereby Russia has had to call upon 12,000 North Korean troops to bolster its front lines and to use them as what I would call cannon fodder to help defend, its lines. But we're also in a spate of what I would call a war of attrition, Daniel, where neither side is necessarily creating any breakthrough opportunities. Rather, it's become much like a trench warfare. Russia perhaps is gaining small, just inch by inch grounds in the eastern part and the Donbass area. But again, Ukraine in the Russian, in the Kursk Oblast is still holding down Russian territory. And just a couple days or so ago, Ukraine really did a significant attack, an air attack through cruise missiles, but also through drones, especially in the Engels Air Base region, where they went after a western or a weapons supply area as well as a refinery area up in Engels, which is several hundred miles away from the front lines. And so all that said, it's still pretty much a war of attrition. But the bottom line for me is Ukraine is holding its own. And Russia, I think, presumably thought they would be in a better position by this time, thinking this 12 months or so ago. But now, 2025, Daniel, is going to be a significant year on how we move forward in this conflict, or Ukraine move forward in this conflict, both militarily, but certainly politically and from a negotiation standpoint.
You just mentioned about Russia's weak position. And how can you assess Russia's failure in Syria and withdrawal of Russia's force and military personnel from the Middle East? How can this influence Vladimir Putin's position before any talks between Putin and Trump can happen?
Well, obviously, with the fall of Assad in Syria, that was a significant blowback to Russia and particularly Putin because of the positioning of U.S.-Russian forces. Not only their air forces there, but also they have a major seaport there in Syria, which now prevents them from being able to operate the Russian fleet in the Mediterranean. They lose their subpen where they're able to resupply and do maintenance on submarines, but also surface ships. And then that in and of itself prevents them from having a major operating base that Putin has been relying on for years with Assad in power to be able to project Russian power, not only from the air into North Africa and even into Central Africa, but also to project naval power in the Mediterranean. They lose their single naval operating base in the Mediterranean. That's significant. And so that's going to play on Putin because not only does he have a conundrum with Ukraine, but now he's got one outside of that area of our operations now in the Mideast. So that's significant.
From your perspective, in what condition Russia enters the year of 2025, taking into account the unsustainable losses on the ground in Ukraine and losses of military equipment, personnel, and also Russia's willingness to liberate the Kursk region. However, they failed to do so, despite Vladimir Putin's orders to liberate the Kursk region of Russia.
Well, Russia has lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, both killed on the battlefield and wounded. They've lost, but just as telling as that is the equipment that they've lost on the battlefield as well. And they're slow to be able to resupply and bring those weapons back on the battlefield. That's point one. Number two, from a geopolitical standpoint, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the fact that Russia is now having to rely on one of its allies in North Korea and to bring in 12,000, as I mentioned. Those are the unclassified numbers that are available to us, but 12,000 troops along the front lines in the battle against Ukraine is significant because he's running low on soldiers, and it's difficult for him to go back to the Russian people and to ask for draftees and conscripts to go on the front lines. I don't believe that it's really particularly significant what those North Korean soldiers play in the current combat experience, but nonetheless, the fact that he has to go to an ally to ask for 12,000 soldiers, that to me is significant. The other aspect of this is that he's what's going to be most telling is not necessarily the loss of soldiers. Frankly, I don't think he cares if he loses Russian soldiers at the pace he's losing them. But what he really cares about is his ability to. He's got a firm hold on power, but really it's the economic, financial condition of Russia and the drain that this war is becoming on Ukraine, against Ukraine. I think is really something that is going to most likely compel him to the negotiating table. It's the finance economic aspects of this because of the leadership and the power structure in Russia. One thing to lose Russian soldiers, but it's another thing to really begin to really be drained on the economy and the financial situation of Russia.
Let's cover also possible negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. The United States, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump said that the war in Ukraine could be finished in 6 months. Also, Kit Kellogg, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, said that all could be settled within 100 days. Moreover, Pete Hegseth, Trump's nominee for the Secretary of Defense, said that the war in Ukraine should end in a good way for Ukrainians. From your perspective, do you believe that a ceasefire could be reached in Ukraine this year?
Well, that's a very tall order. General Kellogg, retired lieutenant general, who's now the president's special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, has publicly asserted that to try to achieve a ceasefire within the first 100 days, as I mentioned, that's a very difficult task in and of itself. But rather than just focusing on Putin and perhaps President Trump, I think the key leader here in at least initiating the negotiation is President Zelensky. And he's the one that's been an extraordinary leader in this, the fight that Putin did that savage attack back on February 24th of 2022. But I think at first we start with President Zelensky and his willingness to come to the negotiating table and under what conditions. Therefore, what I believe, however, I do support the advent of negotiations to bring this war to an end, but it has to be in favor of first U.S. national security interests, but certainly Ukraine. That's very important, and the fact that Ukraine has, as we mentioned earlier, Daniel, up in again Russia and the Kursk Oblast area, and also being able to now take the fight deep into Russia with these, with these unmanned aerial vehicle attacks and so forth, these UAVs. We would want to put Ukraine in the best possible position from a position of strength before we enter into any negotiations. So it will be seen, but I think the next 6 months, certainly through the end of 2025, will be very significant for Ukraine.
And what would it take for Trump's administration and European allies to improve Ukraine's negotiating position?
Well, first and foremost, I think with the President Trump now taking again his administration into play on January 20th after the inauguration, you're going to see a demonstrated leadership there on the world stage, where the United States will lead, and will lead it with peace through strength. I think you're also going to see a formidable ally in President Trump with Ukraine, where he will continue to provide. He's said that continue to provide as best possibly we can the arms and weapon systems and so forth to provide Ukraine, to keep them in the best possible position of strength, all the while trying to seek a negotiated settlement before that that will compel Putin to perhaps come to the table. But I think what's most important now over the next several weeks if not the next few months, is to keep Ukraine effective on the battlefield, to make sure that they are doing the best they possibly can, to keep Russia on its heels, even though Russia's making some small gains in the eastern part of Ukraine and the Donbass region and so forth. But this asymmetric warfare attacks that Ukraine has been committing against Russia, as I mentioned, with this drone attacks against Engel Air Base, for instance, is something that will be significant in keeping Ukraine strong on the battlefield and in a best possible position for a negotiated settlement.
General Newton, you were also in charge of the Air Force, of the strategic aviation. I would like also to cover with you air power. What would Ukraine need to improve its position on the battlefield in the context of, in the matter of air power?
Well, first and foremost, the most important aspect of this is to make sure that Ukraine strives to maintain some modicum of air superiority over its own battle space. And that certainly includes making sure that they have the best preeminent air defenses possible to not only defend their airspace, but certainly defend the Ukrainian people against these savage attacks that Russia plays against with cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and so forth. The other aspect of this is, I think what's important is that Ukraine continue to endeavor to bring new technologies. And I've mentioned these drones, these unmanned aerial vehicles that can not only, go near term in the battle space, but also long-term effects it can have against Russian positions. That in and of itself, from an Air Force standpoint, from a short-term aspect of this war, is significant. The long-term piece of this, though, however, is to continue to provide Ukraine U.S. weaponry. We've provided a small number of F-16s and training to fly the F-16s. That's just a very short-term aspect of building air power for Ukraine. But the longer term is to provide at some point more capable Western air power capabilities so that Ukraine can defend itself, so that it can achieve air superiority over the battlefield in the event that Russia should try to attack again, supposedly after, if we get any type of negotiated settlement here. But air power is the key, not just air power in itself, though, Daniel, but the integrated capabilities of air power with the ground. This air-land battle concept of being able to provide air power not only for support, but use it as a key in interdicting Russian forces or enemy forces, as well as to provide a modicum of offensive capability to keep any adversary on its heels should they decide to attack Ukraine again.
From your perspective, you just mentioned about the air superiority. What kind of number of planes Ukraine would be needed to achieve air superiority, and what types of airplanes should be provided to Ukraine in the long-term perspective?
Well, right now, Ukraine has a relatively old Air Force. They've got, vintage old Soviet fighters, MiG-29s and so forth. And the sources of those parts and equipment in order to sustain an old Soviet-style Air Force is going to run dry here if it hasn't done so already. So I think it's important that as Ukraine continues to grow and build its own Air Force, that it do so based on the Western model of Western capabilities. We've started with a small assortment of F-16 aircraft and so forth, but that's really not the end-all of the solution here. That's just the beginning. And I'm talking over a period of time, maybe many years, Daniel, where you provide Ukraine not only with fighter aircraft, but also provide the training in aircraft, as well as the ability to do tactical airlift and support of its own air forces, but also for its joint operations with Army and Air Force capabilities and so forth. I really can't get into numbers. I don't have necessarily a solution in terms of numbers, but it can't be. It has to be at least in the hundreds to have, from an airframe standpoint. But what's also more important, I think, or just as important, is the weapons that go with those aircraft, the modernization of the weapons themselves, as well as the supply chain, a sustainment of maintenance and parts and equipment in order to sustain that Air Force as well. So it's very complex, but I think having a credible, capable, somewhat modern Air Force for Ukraine moving forward is essential.
Also, I'd like to cover with you Russia's air attacks on Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's decision to use intercontinental ballistic missile or a medium-range ballistic missile. It is interesting that you were also in charge of the intercontinental ballistic missile and such capabilities. How can you assess Vladimir Putin's decision to, for the first time, use such an intercontinental ballistic missile against civilian targets? Does this make any kind of sense?
It makes no sense. In fact, in my view, going after civilian targets in any way, and if it's a small drone all the way up to an intercontinental ballistic missile, that's a war crime, Daniel, and that's one that Putin ought to be held accountable for. The fact that he has capabilities, though, I would remind our viewers that Putin and Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world, and that he has, at least through his words, has said that he is willing to use those nuclear weapons should, from his perspective, the Russian homeland be threatened. But that creates a very unstable situation. That's why I think it's important that we continue to support Ukraine. We continue to have a very strong NATO in order to deter Putin from using those capabilities, such as you mentioned, intercontinental ballistic missiles or even medium-range ballistic missiles. It's also very important, I think, for us to really understand is in order to deter an adversary like Putin, it certainly takes capability. And NATO and U.S.-led NATO has significant capability, but it also takes will. You need, in order to deter an adversary such as a Putin, to make sure that he understands that we've got the demonstrated capability and that we also have the political will to be able to use those capabilities in the event that he decides to, try to attack either a NATO member or an allied or friend of ours. So we must, again, not appease Putin in this regard in terms of his saber rattling. We must continue to show this strength. And as President Trump said, that's really how we demonstrate peace through strength, regardless, Daniel, if it's through an intercontinental ballistic missile or it could be against, one of their bomber aircraft, or it could be other weapons that Putin has in his arsenal.
Let's cover also President Biden's political legacy on Ukraine. And now there are the last days of his presidency. How can you assess the main decisions of Biden administration which were made on Ukraine after the beginning of the full-scale invasion and throughout these years of the war in Ukraine?
I think the U.S. has been effective in leading NATO, and you've also seen the rejuvenation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization under President Biden at this point. But my concern has been all along, and I've been public about this, is President Biden the United States has indeed provided weapons to Ukraine, but we've done it in a way that we put too many restrictions on, for instance, ATACMS and HIMARS and so forth, that have limited the real full range of capability of the weapon systems that the United States has provided. And that's been a policy led by President Biden. I think it's really delayed some of the capabilities and the ability to allow President Zelensky in Ukraine to fight back effectively. It's certainly the commitment and the dedication, the tenacity of the Ukrainian people has really been key here for your own nation's survival. And I would have, and I've advocated for, but I would have asked President Biden to unleash the full military capabilities of the weapon systems we provided, as I mentioned, first and foremost. And secondly, I think it's important that we continue to provide these weapon systems, and we can certainly make sure that Ukraine is supplied and resupplied with these capabilities, not only from the air defense systems we provided, but from, somewhat offensive weapon systems as well. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to get in a war of attrition. It'll be trench warfare, much like we saw in World War I. Meanwhile, Russia and Putin will still be able to affect, the battle space and cause, frankly, terror and havoc among innocent Ukrainian civilians. And if that does not go, addressed, then Putin will maintain his hand. I would have hoped that President Biden would have been stronger from that standpoint, because my final point here is not necessarily, certainly trying to compel President Putin from the savagery against Ukrainian people and the use of U.S. weapons and our deterrent capabilities. It's one thing for us vis-a-vis what's happening in Ukraine. But our adversaries elsewhere, such as China, I think it's been rather weak from the Biden administration, somewhat politically and diplomatically, that China, other adversaries are taking note of that. And so we have to bolster our defenses, bolster our deterrence. And that's the legacy I think President Biden has left.
Thank you, General Newton, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Daniel. Always delighted to be with you, and best wishes to you and the Ukrainian people.
Thank you, General.